Henry George, the Philadelphia native who twice stood for the office of mayor of New York City, devoted his life to ending the social conditions that prevailed in New York and every other city, large and small. What follows is the story of how Henry George hoped to improve life in New York. Written and narrated by Edward J. Dodson. After finishing the manuscript for his book Progress in Poverty in March of 1879, Henry George dedicated the work to those who, seeing the vice and misery that spring from the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege, feel the possibility of a higher social state and would strive for its attainment. In August of 1880, Henry George boarded a train in San Francisco that would bring him to New York City. He was about to enter a world he had been describing from a distance. As a young lad, Henry had arrived in New York City as a cabin boy on an old merchant ship, the Hindu. In a letter written to his family, he described what he saw. The upper part of New York is a beautiful place. The streets wide, clear, and regular. The houses all a brown stone and standing 10 or 20 feet from the pavement with gardens in front. Shortly after his arrival in New York, Henry was contacted by members of the Democratic Committee to speak to working men on the tariff question. From the dawn of the nation, the federal government had relied upon revenue raised by taxing goods that came into the country from elsewhere. The result was higher prices on goods that, protectionists argued, could not have been profitably produced domestically. The New York politicians had not studied their man or his views on tariffs and his commitment to free trade. As Henry later wrote, I told them that I had heard of a high tariff Democrat, though I could not conceive how there could be such a thing. And I knew there were men who called themselves revenue tariff Democrats. But there was also another kind of Democrat, and that was a no tariff Democrat. And that what was wanted was to sweep away the custom houses and custom house officers and have free trade. No more invitations came from the party to speak on the tariff question. However, Henry was then approached by a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Abram S. Hewitt, to work for him on an investigative report dealing with conditions of working people. This provided a modest income during the early period when the sale of his book, Progress in Poverty, was still quite low. Back in San Francisco, Henry's wife put their home up for sale, although a decision to bring the family east had not yet been made. In a letter to Edward Taylor, Henry wrote, My wife thinks she can get along cheaper at boarding than keeping house, so I have told her to sell out. So life goes. My pleasant little home that I was so comfortable in is gone, and I am afloat at 42, poorer than at 21. I do not complain, but there is some bitterness in it. Upon learning of Henry George's death in 1897, his friend John Russell Young recalled the circumstances of that early period in New York City. Those early New York days were of extreme and honorable poverty. It was a daring experiment, this unknown gentleman, with no aid but his own high spirit, nothing in his carpet bag but one book of gospel, coming at 42 to make his way into the heart of mighty Babylon. Soon, however, sales of Progress in Poverty picked up, as did the number of invitations for Henry George to speak on the land question and on free trade. One convert to Henry George's principles, Francis G. Shaw, a prosperous resident of Staten Island, purchased 1,000 copies of Progress in Poverty to place in libraries all across the United States. Upon his return in the fall of 1882 from covering the political upheaval in Ireland, Henry George addressed the New York luminaries who welcomed him home. What is the terrible thing I want to do? I want in the first place to remove all restrictions upon production of wealth, and in doing this, I want to secure that fair distribution of wealth which will give every man that which he has fairly earned. I propose to abolish all taxation which falls upon the exertion of labor or the use of capital or the accumulation of wealth, and to meet all public expenses out of that fund which arises not from the exertion of any individual, but from the growth of the whole community. Consider, gentlemen, how this city would grow, how enormously wealth would increase, if all taxes were abolished which now bear on the production and accumulation and exchange of wealth. Consider how quickly the vacant spaces on the island would fill up could land not improved be had by him who wanted to improve it, without the payment of prices now demanded. By this time, Henry was becoming recognized as a leading authority on the issues affecting working people. Appearing before the Senate Committee upon the relations between labor and capital, Henry responded to questions put to him by Senator Wilkinson Call of Florida. We should be glad to have a statement from you in your own way of any facts that may be within your knowledge in regard to the condition of labor in its relations to capital, and any suggestions of remedies which you think would bring about an improved condition of things. Among the insights Henry conveyed to the senators that day was why reform of law and taxation was so desperately needed even in the United States, which still seemed like such a young and sparsely populated nation. The fact that in new countries wages, generally speaking, are higher than they are in old countries is simply because in those new countries, as we call them, the soil has not yet passed fully into private hands. As access to the land is closed, the competition between laborers for employment from a master becomes more intense, and wages are steadily forced down to the lowest amount on which the laborer can live. Among a growing list of progressives who joined with Henry George in the campaign to end the monopoly control over nature was Terence Powderly, leader of the Knights of Labor. As Powderly explained, "In my opinion, the main, all-absorbing question of the hour is the land question. The 8-hour law, the prohibition of child labor, and the currency question are all of weighty moment to the toiler, but high above them all stands the land question." Henry George finally brought his family from California to New York City, and they rented rooms in a building on 14th Street near 7th Avenue. Of New York, Henry wrote, "In this great city, the metropolis of the Western Hemisphere, municipal government has reached a pitch of corruption that, the world over, throws a slur and a doubt upon free institutions." In 1886, supporters urged him to enter into the competition for the office of mayor of New York City. Tammany sent city official William Ivins to persuade Henry George not to run for mayor. George later recalled their exchange. "You tell me that I cannot possibly be elected mayor of New York. Why, if I cannot possibly get the office, do you want me to withdraw?" William Ivins, Henry recalled, told him, "You cannot be elected, but your running will raise hell." To this, Henry responded, "You have relieved me of embarrassment. I do not want the responsibility and the work of the office of the mayor of New York, but I do want to raise hell. I am decided and will run." Accepting the nomination, Henry George declared his intentions if he should win. Look over our vast city, and what do we see? On one side, a very few men, richer by far than it is good for men to be, and on the other side, a great mass of men and women struggling to get a most pitiful living. Years ago, I came to this city from the West, unknown, knowing nobody, and I saw and recognized for the first time the shocking contrast between monstrous wealth and debasing want. And here I made a vow, from which I have never faltered, to seek out and remedy, if I could, the cause that condemned little children to lead such lives as you know them to lead in the squalid districts. Days before the voting occurred, President Grover Cleveland dedicated the new Statue of Liberty. To Henry George, the fog that enveloped the statue would have been more than ironic. How was liberty to be realized under the existing conditions? In 1890, Henry George recalled once again his arrival in New York City. When I went across the continent before the railway was completed, and in the streets of New York for the first time realized the contrasts of wealth and want that are to be found in a great city, saw those sights that, to the man who comes from the West, affright and appall, the problem grew upon me. An estimated 30,000 members of New York's trades unions, cheering for Henry George, marched past Union Square prior to the election. The votes counted, Henry George was awarded 31% of the total. He finished ahead of Theodore Roosevelt, but behind the Tammany-endorsed candidate Abram Hewitt. After the election, Henry returned to the lecture circuit to continue his campaign for reforms. On the 8th of January, 1887, the first issue of his newspaper, The Standard, appeared. In 1888, Henry moved the family to a building located at 357 East 19th Street. Late in life, with the war against privilege still so far from being won, Henry was asked, "How do you explain the Savior's declaration that the poor ye have always with you?" George responded, "Because he was talking to the scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites." If anything, the living conditions for a great many people living in New York City had worsened since his arrival. In 1895 in New York, Henry attended a meeting at Cooper Union to discuss a report produced by the Tenement House Commission. He addressed those assembled declaring, "Of the 21 recommendations in the report, some are good and some are bad. Some are indifferent, but all are alike in that they go nowhere toward the settlement of the question the committee has brought up. You can turn the East Side with its tenements into the most beautiful part of the city, and the results will be that our millionaires will soon be living there. You want to tear down those tenements and let no one live there unless he has 600 feet of cubic air. Where are the people turned out from those houses to go? Into the streets? Into the police stations that this very night are crowded? Or into the almshouses? It seems to me that when we talk of quackery, the greatest quack of all is he who tells you to go slow, is the quack who would substitute charity for justice, is the quack who tells you that in instituting reform, no one need be hurt. When Henry George died in 1897 during his second campaign for the office of mayor of New York City, he would at least feel he had done all he could to change the course of history. Privilege and poverty had worsened during his life, but his generation and generations to come now had his writings for guidance and his life as an example of dedication, courage, and self-sacrifice. Thank you.